Welcome back to another podcast episode where we help aspiring developers get jobs and junior developers grow. In this one, we're going to be diving into how to become a back-end developer. I actually did an episode with this gentleman a little while ago. I thought it was pretty good. Check it out. Backend Banter is the podcast. But yeah, we're going to dive into how the hell you become a back-end developer, because I get a lot of brand new developers. And if you're a brand new developer, this is definitely for you. But I get a lot of brand new developers that think like becoming a back-end developer isn't for them in their future for like 5 years. They think it's like the hardest thing to get into. And so I brought on a backend developer. We're going to dive into exactly how you can get it done. But yeah, Lane, thank you so much for coming on again.
Yeah, so glad to be here. Great to chat with you one more time.
Yeah, for sure. Let's just dive into it. So basically, who are you? Like, what is your backend experience and why should people care what you have to say?
Yeah, good question. Well, the jury's still out on whether they should care, but I can tell you about my experience. I started programming around 2010, building toy stuff in high school. So I took a programming class at kind of the local community college around that time, and I got started building just little scripts. So I was a big StarCraft 2 fan at the time. I mean, still am, but it's an older game now. And I wrote this little battle simulator in Python. And that was one of the first times that I really got programming in the sense that I built some loops. I'd done some things. You had these things called variables. Everything felt really abstract. Like I was kind of just doing math. But when I was able to solve a problem, specifically for a video game that I was really into at the time, I thought that was pretty cool. So I took that project to a local code camp, won a little prize. I think got a $25 gift card and a backpack. But it was pretty exciting to me. So that kind of kicked off my whole programming journey. I went and got a CS degree at that same local community college. And then I had I would kind of describe it as a fast career progression from, your standard junior developer, mid-level developer, team lead, and then a hiring manager before finally starting the company that I work at today, which is Boot Dev.
So in your dev positions, first of all, I love StarCraft 2, but in your dev positions, what were you focused on? Were you leaning a little bit more back end, a little bit more front end?
Yeah, so I've never really been professionally employed as a front-end developer, at least technically speaking. All of my roles have been back-end oriented. There were times where I had to dip into the front end, and certainly I taught myself a lot of front-end stuff for later positions where I was kind of over a larger team and I had to understand the front-end side of the stack, or I even had to, go pick up tickets. But I started as a back-end developer, and that's really been where the focus of my career has been, specifically in Python and Go.
Python and Go. Okay. Let's just dive into it. For people that are trying to get started, so I'm going to give you, a certain type of person. I am trying to get into coding. I find that I don't really like front end that much. I've explored just a tiny bit, but I want to become a back end developer. And I've been given this advice that, brand new people, they're not allowed to become back end developers, right? It's kind of, gate kept for people with a little bit more experience. And the argument usually is, managing a little bit more critical systems, managing the database, managing very crucial information that wouldn't be the trust wouldn't be given towards me. So what actually, let me just ask you this. Do you think new developers can become back-end developers, or do you have to start with the front end first?
It's a good question. So there's there's some truth to what you just said, but the conclusion of the question is no, you don't need to be a front-end developer before you can be a back-end developer, and you can get your start as a back-end developer. Just the binary answer is it must be true because I did it and I know plenty of people that went that route. So absolutely, you can start with back-end development. There are maybe, though, some threads that you opened up that we can tease apart if you'd like. For example, is it harder to learn back-end development, or does it take a little longer? I would say there's some truth to that, but I would also say it's not nearly as intimidating as most people I've talked to have been led to believe that it is. And what I mean is, if you figure that it takes, I'm just throwing out a number, because it takes way too long to explain all of the different the nuances that go into this. But let's say it takes on average 12 months to learn kind of what you would need to get started as an entry-level front-end developer. Let's just assume that that's the case. I would say to become a backend developer would probably take 15 months. So add 25%.
Okay. Interesting. Where do you start?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like everyone starts with HTML and CSS, right? At least online. And that was what was so interesting to me when I started to get into the online learning world. Because the only reason I was really driven to online learning was because my wife wanted to learn to code. So I'd gotten a traditional CS degree, kind of worked my way up through entry-level jobs. My wife was working at the hospital and she was really interested in getting into coding. She has a strong math background, really likes, logical thinking, problem solving, huge fan of puzzles. And so I started poking around because I'm like, well, half the developers I work with don't have CS degrees. So it's pretty crazy, when you're 25, 26 with a degree to want to go back to college. So I started looking and I was very surprised that the curriculums for kind of e-learning programs or even boot camps often were so different from what I saw in my CS degree. I don't think I learned HTML or CSS until after my C++ class even. Like I'd taken Python, I'd taken C++, object-oriented programming, all these things, before I even really built a web page. And when you're focused on the back end, which to be clear, CS degrees aren't necessarily focused on the back end either. They're focused on computer science. But when you are focused on the back end side of the stack, you don't necessarily need to start with the visual stuff, with the web pages. You can start with command line scripting and little command line apps that just kind of do interesting things with data. And frankly, I'm glad it started that way because I don't know if I would have stuck with it if it was HTML and CSS. I'm just not that, especially at the time, I just wasn't that interested in building websites. I wanted to compute stuff. You know what I mean? I wanted to do interesting things with data.
So that's an interesting comment, one that I very much agree with. Coding boot camps really don't line up with what you're learning at computer science degrees. And I've gone through a lot of coding boot camp curriculums and I've heard different advice. I brought on a lot of people from coding boot camps. A lot of coding boot camps advertise as full stack. You're going to become a full stack software engineer. And it just feels like the knowledge of the graduates coming out, it's all surface level. So they'll teach multiple backend languages. And I think that's something you do with your course, but they'll stuff it into 4 months and they'll really condense it down. And I find that just programming fundamentals in general are very much lacking and they're just not reinforced. And a lot of graduates need to look up tons of information because it's just so rushed. But I feel like coding bootcamps, they kind of just touch on the surface level of it. They give you exposure and then the expectation, it's sold to you oh yeah, you'll be job ready as a backend developer, front-end developer, whatever you want to do. But then kind of at the end, they're like, by the way, we kind of just give you a little bit of an outline, a little bit of exposure. So now you need to do the rest, right? So I do feel like coding boot camps, they don't go deep enough at all. But more specifically, what do you think coding boot camps are lacking to really prepare backend software engineers?
So I think there was a model, and to be clear, I think there are good boot camps and I think there are bad ones. I've definitely seen examples of both. And if a boot camp is in 2023 advertising 4 months, I think it's probably a bad one. It's hard to say that in a blanket way, but I mean, 4 months is just probably too quick to go as deep as I would like students to go. I think the model of coding boot camps that really started to crop up around 10 years ago worked for a while because there was such an enormous pressure to get more developers into tech because companies were making money hand over fist. I mean, they still are. Companies have been making money hand over fist in tech, but there was such a vacuum of developers 10 years ago. And so, training someone up for 3 or 4 months, handing them off as an entry-level developer to a company, companies were more than happy to pick them up under the assumption that we're going to train this person for another 6 months. We're going to keep teaching them things they need to know. But you've done the hard work of getting them most of the way there, teaching them the fundamentals that frankly, we don't have the time to teach them. Right. I think that model worked really well. I think for particularly the last 2 years, it's been really rough, right? With this tech recession and the layoffs, where the bar has been raised and nothing fundamentally about what we do as developers has changed. It's just the market's changed, right? Competition is higher. And it ebbs and flows. Like, I'm not a doomsday believer in tech. Like, I do think that we'll have plenty more kind of bull runs in tech where it's going to be, crazy hiring frenzies again. It's hard to predict when those things will happen. But I do think that, like, today, you just need to go so much more in depth than what was required in the past. And the boot camps that haven't accepted that, like, fundamental truth of the market, can do a disservice to their students.
A big question is, how much do I need to know, right? Like, where's that line in the sand? If someone asks you that question, how do you answer that question?
It's kind of a fundamentally flawed question, but, like, I totally get it. Like, everyone's asking it and they have every right to ask it. Here's the problem. You can't know. Like, you can't know that. When you start to learn to code, you have no idea where your first job in tech will eventually be. At least no one I know has ever had that experience, where when you start writing your first lines of code, you know exactly where you're going to work. And the problem with that is every job that you could conceivably have as your first job in tech will have you doing very different things day to day, right, as a developer. And so optimizing some learning path from where you are now to that specific job is almost a fool's errand because you just can't make those optimizations early on. So my kind of philosophy around this is that you just need to accept the fact that you're going to be learning a broader set of skills, and that some of those skills may not be directly applicable to the very first job that you'll have in tech, but they'll almost certainly be useful and very likely useful down the line. But because you've picked up on that broader set of skills, you'll look better and stand out amongst the competition of people that have tried to sort of minimize their learning path. But it also just means that you'll be more qualified for a larger pool of jobs, right? Because you have this more general foundation. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't specialize in something. I think it's good to do that too. But approaching the whole learning process with a mindset of, like, I want to get really good at this stuff, and I want to understand how things work, like, one layer deeper, right? Like, if I'm learning React, I want to understand how JavaScript works. If I'm learning JavaScript and promises, I want to understand, like, how promises actually kind of, wait for the network request to come back, and why that mechanism works the way that it does. Because if you do that, even though it can feel like that takes a little bit longer, it actually shortens the experience because you're spinning your wheels much less than you otherwise would be.
I like that. In the JavaScript world, there's a lot of abstraction, and it seems like, this is the frustration with just people wanting to get into JavaScript. They want to do it fast. For some reason, it's the fast lane. It's not. There are so many people trying to become developers, even front-end developers, and dive in, like, pick up a React job, and their JavaScript and just programming fundamentals suck. Like, they just dove in too quickly. They didn't really figure out I like what you said, like, what's happening under the hood. Why does this work? Why is it this way? Right. Because even in my coding boot camp, we were exposed to a little bit more, like, low level stuff. We didn't really dive into a low level programming language, but, we learned that, the garbage collection, while it might not be extremely efficient with JavaScript, like, it was convenient, right? We didn't have to worry about anything in memory, and, like, just get kind of understanding that, and understanding that these abstractions do exist to make it easier, but what is actually happening. I feel like that's really important for backend developers specifically. Like, you can get away with a little bit more abstraction as front end, but I feel like a lot of hiring managers, they're hiring backend developers that are very curious, that keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper. I love what you said about that.
Yeah, so, that's definitely been my experience. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
No, I was going to say that's definitely been my experience. One interesting, this is essentially just an anecdote, but one thing that really stuck out to me, and one of the reasons I've been so passionate about e-learning on the back end side, is I was working at a company, this is now 4 years ago, probably closer to 3. I was a hiring manager on a backend team. We had 3 devs. I was looking for a 4th. And the team that I worked most closely with, they had a React app that they were responsible for maintaining. And they needed essentially a React developer plus like a little bit of Node experience. And when the manager of that team opened up the job opportunity on LinkedIn and Indeed and all the normal places, like hundreds of applicants within the first week, right? When I opened up the application for a Go developer on my team, tens of applications, right? Like there was literally an order of magnitude difference between the number of people that were applying for that JavaScript position versus the Go position. Like I interviewed almost half of the people that applied to the position I was hiring for that at least didn't have just like completely bullshit resumes. Like of the like reasonable resumes I got, I was like interviewing half these people. And that really stuck with me. So, we talk about, this is just something that I think is important to share in the sense that we talk about how a language like JavaScript, there's lots of jobs for it. And that is true. There's also a lot of competition for it. And there can be times where it makes sense to give yourself a skill that's just a skill that not everyone has. It's not the most popular skill, but there's still plenty of jobs that are looking for it, but you happen to be one of the few that possess this skill, right? That's actually how I got my start in Go. Go was not popular when I learned it in college. This is 2015. It was very, very new. I thought it was cool. I thought it was fun. I built some weird projects with it, with a Raspberry Pi. And that really stuck out when I applied to Go developer jobs. I'd applied to hundreds of Python jobs. I was frankly having a harder time. The few Go jobs that I applied to, I was hearing back for more regularly, probably just because it was a smaller niche.
Yeah, it makes sense what you're saying. And everyone wants to learn JavaScript, and the hundreds of people are applying to every single JavaScript position for the most part. You have that opportunity with Go. So that's the thing. You're sacrificing the number of opportunities for you being able to stand out a bit more. Do you feel like companies are hiring a lot of entry-level developers with Go?
That's a good question. I don't know. I haven't done enough research to answer the question well. I do know that a lot of the Go positions for a while, this again, like 5 years ago, were companies that were transitioning to Go, either off of specifically like Ruby or Java, sometimes Python, for performance reasons. And so they were looking for more experienced Go developers to make that transition. I got my first Go job as essentially an entry-level developer. Technically, I'd had a year of experience as a part-time developer. So I wasn't quite brand new, but I was pretty dang close. The irony, though, and this is just about Go specifically, is that Go is arguably the easiest programming language to learn. It's just such a small syntax. Like even compared to Python, like getting started with programming in Python, I would argue is easier because the syntax is just a little less verbose. But learning the language of Python, like all of the nooks and crannies and all of the features, takes much, much longer than learning Go. And to be clear, I'm not saying you should go learn Go or you should go find some little programming language because that's the right strategy. My point is just that you should be learning what's interesting to you, and you shouldn't be afraid to spend some time learning something interesting because you're worried that there aren't jobs in that thing. Like, even if you don't go work in it, being able to be like, hey, I built this weird ass project that I thought was really fun that did this very specific thing. That just shows that you care, right? Yeah. And it can stand out even if you are applying for, a standard kind of React, Next.js, JavaScript, Python, like whatever, a very kind of mainstream company.
Ooh, I love that. I have a lot to say about that, but I'm going to condense it. I have a lot of people that come into my community. Don, what am I supposed to learn? Don, tell me what to learn. Don, tell me how to become a developer. And like my big question in my head is, why'd you get into coding? Like, what have you built anything so far? No, I haven't built anything so far. I picked up a MERN stack tutorial and, just going through that. When I get done, I'm going to start applying for jobs. I'm like, my question still is like, why'd you get into coding? What makes you curious? The number of people, and I don't think it's like a fault to the people. I think it's just a mindset we got to continue destroying, but it's just like, people don't understand software engineering. Like, a lot of developers, a lot of programmers became programmers because they were able to manipulate the computer. They were able to create things. They were able to do things through a programming language. There's power. It feels good to be able to do that. It's awesome to create stuff. And I think there are a lot of people coming into this industry just wanting more money, and that's fine if you want more money, but you got to really explore that curiosity, or you're not going to hit that finish line. All the good software engineers I know, they're curious. And I had an old boss who, when he was trying to become a developer, he would build stupid apps. He's just like, I wonder if I could build a mobile app and just get people to download it. He built a coaster for his phone, and it was very low rated, but it had a lot of downloads. He's like, okay, I learned how to build a mobile app. Now I'm going to go ahead and build a script for my Xbox. Now I'm going to go ahead and mess with my Raspberry Pi. And like you, he kept exploring, and building a coaster isn't necessarily going to make you marketable, but he was just curious, can I do this? Can I create this? And he loved it. Right. And I feel like I get so many people coming into my community, they're just robots. Tell me what to build. I'm going to spend the next, or tell me what to learn. I'm going to spend the next 6 months in a course learning everything I need to. I'm going to master it. I'm going to create note cards and flashcards and just study them. And then I'm going to go over the course again. I'm really going to reinforce this knowledge. And they'll spend at least 6 months, 9 months, and they haven't built anything. I'm like, what the hell gets you excited? And then what happens? They get burned out. And that they don't know why they get burned out, or they blame the economy for them not getting a job, or they blame external circumstances, and they just need to continue pushing further, diving in, exploring more. But they just spend so much time doing what they're told, or they're just doing what they think they're supposed to do. They're learning what they think they're supposed to learn, and they're kind of treating it this goes back to traditional education. This is why I brought it up in your podcast episode. They're kind of just tell me what to learn, I'll learn it, but they don't take ownership and authority over their journey, over creating random things, and just igniting that passion with programming. And maybe I'm just venting right now, but I feel like so many aspiring developers, they don't like to explore, and they like to fit into this nice linear path that's perfect into landing that position. And often that linear path, I find, they burn out along the way, and most people like that, they don't become developers.
Yeah. So 2 things here. The first is that learning to code, learning to be a programmer, learning to be an engineer, and I use that term just to kind of level up our thinking about the job that we're doing. I think developer implies more of a code monkey, whereas you can become an engineer without having a degree if you're willing to study to that level and build projects to that level, right? Programming languages have been invented by people that don't have degrees. So, sorry, where I was going with this was, you mentioned a couple things. One was the economy in 2022 and 2023 has been very rough for programmers. The interesting thing about that is that kind of means that the people who started learning to code, or really spent the bulk of their time learning to code in 2020 and 2021, when the economy was best for developers, that was the best 2 years for developers in the last decade. It's 2020, 2021. Obviously, pandemic was terrible, but for the economy of tech, it was booming. That was the worst time to be learning, because it meant when you started applying for jobs in 2022 and 2023, you're having a really rough time. We don't know that this is true yet, but I tend to believe that 2022 and 2023 will be some of the better years to be learning to code, because 2024 and 2025, we've already started to see signs of market recovery. But at the end of the day, I don't believe that it's a good strategy, or I should say a useful strategy, to try to time the tech market for when you're going to break in. If you're going to be a successful engineer, you need to be exactly what we just talked about, which is you need to be curious, you need to be learning, you need to be willing to learn stuff that You might not even use it that first job. And the market's going to be the market, right? Learning to code is not a get rich quick scheme. Like if that's what you thought, or if that's what someone told you, if that's what you saw an ad for, that learning to code is something you do quickly and you can make a lot of money doing it. Like, I just want to be the person to tell you that's not true. Like, learning to code is I call it a get upper middle class slow scheme. Like, yes, you will be a good earner, right? You will be upper middle class, right? You can earn six figures as a developer. Absolutely. You can earn more than that if you go on to become a manager, a CTO. Like, you can make a lot of money, but it's not quick. Like, you're going to spend a few years learning, and then you're going to spend more years progressing in your career to get to those levels. So, is it a good plan for a lot of people? Yes. And but it's not a get rich quick scheme. Not that I'd recommend looking for those either.
I love that. I really do. And it's a mindset that can shift. I think so. Even people just coming into this industry, even just wanting to become backend developers, because I think they might even pay just a tiny bit more in different areas, but people that are kind of doing it for the money, I think they can transition into finding enjoyment. And I think like the big message is just like really just build, have fun with it. I love what you said, like even if it's not going to be linear to landing that position, if you want to learn some obscure language or library because it excites you, you're like, this is really interesting. I'm getting bored of the path I'm going down. Like, learn it, ignite that fire again. I love that. So yeah, and I also like what you said, like, learn now going into 2000. So a lot of people are going through hard times right now, and it's easy to feel like this will never let up. And the tech market will continue to go up and down. The tech market is here for a very long time. It will continue to go up and down. So just stopping learning how to code now, like this is the perfect time to learn how to code, to actually prepare for when the market starts recovering. But there's also, so I like the idea of being curious. I like the idea of like learning kind of obscure things and, building a race car with a Raspberry Pi that does something. Like I like those kind of things, but also, I get that people do want to be efficient with their time. So a lot of times they want to become a backend developer, right? So they've gained confidence that they can, but where do they start? Do they just pick up a random programming language? Do they just pick up a programming language with tons of tutorials and like a community around it? Like JavaScript is a big one with that, but are there like a lot of node positions, node backend positions specifically? Because, I think there's a bit of a misconception that there's tons of node positions. No, there's tons of JavaScript positions specifically that's spread out between the front end and back end. So do they pick up JavaScript? Do they pick up Python because it's, or do they pick up Go because it's easier to learn? Like, where do they start? So, in a month or two, they could start really getting curious and building things.
So in the front end world, it's pretty simple, right? You start with HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and people post this on Twitter as if it's, groundbreaking news. But HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and like maybe pick up framework. If you're super trendy, you pick up Tailwind, right? On the back end, I would argue it's a little different because it's less technology focused at the beginning. I start my students on boot.dev in Python, simply because I think Python is a great language to like learn computer science basics. So like I teach Python, basic syntax, intro to coding, object-oriented programming, functional programming, data structures and algorithms, like go through all that very fundamental stuff in Python, just because it's kind of a language that gets out of your way. Some students go on to program in Python in their jobs and backend positions, others don't. And I think that's totally fine. Right. The interesting thing about backend development as opposed to front end development is you can use essentially any language for it. On the front end, we're constrained by what the browser does, right? Assuming you're working in a browser and not a mobile app environment, like you literally just can only do what the browser has made available to you. So you render documents in HTML, right? And you style them with CSS and you change them around with JavaScript. And sometimes a framework will make some of that easier for you. On the back end, you can do literally anything you want. You can deploy you can choose what operating system you deploy on. You can deploy on Windows, you can deploy on Linux. If you're sane, if you're crazy, you can deploy on Mac. Like you do whatever you want, pick any programming language. So it's really hard to shoot yourself in the foot with technology choices when you're learning backend development, so long as you're picking up the fundamentals along the way. So like I mentioned, getting started, I do have a strong belief that it is very much worth your time to pick up CS basics, data structures, algorithms, object-oriented programming, functional programming, like these things that transcend language boundaries. You learn it in Python, it still makes sense in your head. Once you learn the syntax of Go, you can implement the same thing in Go. Not a problem, right? Because you've picked up these fundamental skills, they're very transferable. And then once you have that really solid like CS foundation, sky starts to be the limit. But like I would say at that point, it's important to start getting familiar with more specific technologies, right? Exploring specific databases, maybe picking up a backend framework. Although if you're interested in Go, I would argue that's probably not necessarily the case. Go is kind of a unique programming language in that way. Frameworks tend to not be super popular. But it's really as simple as that, like 2-step process of like foundations and then technologies. And the list, unfortunately, is endless. There's certainly some more important core technologies. Like I would argue, you really need to be familiar with at least one SQL database. You need to know how to build like a CRUD server, create, read, update, delete. There are some things that are essentially non-negotiable, but the list is pretty small. And there's an endless sea of things that you can go on to eventually learn. And you don't have to learn those things before your first job. That's like critically important to point out.
With the endless sea of things.
Yeah. Gotcha. Like you can just learn these like pretty core technologies and get your first job. And then you can either learn the things that are just interesting to you as you continue to move on with your career, or what is also very likely is at your job, you will be required to pick up, weird esoteric stuff.
Yeah. I want to dive into, I guess, a little bit more technical requirements. I like that you mentioned, like, really pick up an SQL database. I think a lot of people, there are just so many tutorials. It's just like, I love JavaScript. I can build almost anything I want with it. And that's why I love it. It's not necessarily the syntax or the language, but I feel like the programming world has become flooded with JavaScript tutorials, and even and people that feel like they're kind of forced to learn JavaScript, but also I don't know why so many tutorials keep encouraging developers, aspiring full stack developers, to learn Mongo and Mongoose and a non-relational database. And they don't even pick up a relational database. They don't really have to think about how it's structured and how the data is organized. And that could be a really frustrating experience, but I'm a huge proponent for pushing relational database. Do that first. And even just don't lean heavily on an ORM right away. Get comfortable with some SQL queries, something really light where you can write a bunch of custom queries. And SQL is pretty tricky. I remember when I was on a coding boot camp and I had a Chromebook, and I used an online editor and MIDI server to do everything that I needed to, which is awesome. Everyone else had a MacBook. I couldn't afford it at the time. And then I remember I installed dual booted Linux on my Chromebook. It was a terrible idea. And basically it just had no hardware to handle it. But I remember just running a couple of joins and trying to figure out this bug that was occurring to me, because my data that I was reading from the database was just it was given to me line by line by line, every second. I'm like, why the hell is this happening? And I had my instructor trying to debug it. And that was my first lesson of I got to be careful of the size of the join, right?
Yeah.
And so, but just getting a feel of that, and just getting a feel of how unoptimized your queries can be, it feels it's golden knowledge for a lot of backend developers. And, sometimes when you get these JavaScript tutorials, everything is just abstraction after abstraction. You have no idea what's going on. And so I've seen just a lot of backend developers really dive deep into what's happening under the hood with that kind of stuff. And that's how they stand out, right? So I guess my question to you is what really makes a good backend developer stand out versus, one that's kind of just going through some MERN stack tutorial and they learn how to just build a CRUD app, which, hundreds of other people applying for that position probably can do anyways, versus like a new backend developer that really stands out? How do you figure that out?
So there's two things. The first is like how they were trained. And then the second is like how you can actually stand out on your like resume and in the interview. And I think they're like slightly different. So let me tackle like the how they were trained part first. The first thing I want to say is like, as someone who makes tutorials sometimes, I think tutorials are a huge problem. The reason being, when you follow a tutorial to do a thing, all of the learning has been stripped out. So when you build your own StarCraft 2 simulator using Python with the weird, very basic understanding of Python that you have, you do a lot of learning along the way, right? You're Googling very specific things. You're looking at very specific blog posts or tutorials, but to do very small parts of the greater whole that you're trying to build. So there's a lot of learning that you're doing. When you're following a full tutorial to do a full stack application with Mern and Next.js, all of the learning has been stripped away. You're reading an instruction manual. And if you do enough of those, you can start to pick up on some patterns. But I would argue it's not the most efficient use of your time if your goal is just to learn foundational stuff. And so this kind of applies to what you're talking about with SQL and Mongo. You want to learn what's going on. So we have an SQL course on Boot Dev, and it's my philosophy to the whole thing is like, let's just learn what relational means. Like, let's learn this conceptual stuff that's going to apply to SQLite. It's going to apply to Postgres. It's going to apply to MySQL. I'm really just a big fan of, as you're going through your learning, try to learn the stuff that's going to be useful no matter where you go. And the problem with like very streamlined tutorials to build very specific projects is just that, like I said, a lot of the learning is often stripped out. The next part of your question about like, how do I stand out as a backend developer? I think it's the same thing as a front-end developer. It's just a different type of project. So I'm a big believer in personal projects. The more impressive, the better. And impressive does not always mean complex, right? There's a lot of ways to make a project unique and interesting. But if you can show me that you've built something fun and interesting and that you had to think a lot to build it, it wasn't just some YouTube tutorial that you followed, that to me is still the most impressive thing you can have on your resume, other than, of course, like actual work experience, which really, if you think about work experience, it's just a project. It's just a project that someone paid you to do. So it's just a project with social proof, right? It's just a project that you built that I can now call somebody on the phone and say, hey, did they actually build that? Yes. Okay, good. Like, that's all work experience is. You can get so close to having actual work experience on your resume without getting hired if your projects are good, right?
So first of all, I guess I'm going to tackle what you said previously. The tutorials strip the learning. Like, it's an instruction manual. I actually love that. I never thought of it like that, but I mean, it explains tutorial hell perfectly. But a lot of people just get trapped in tutorials and they don't really learn. Even a lot of my live Q&As, they're coming in with random questions that are easily Googleable. It's like they could type their exact question in chat and come up with something. And then I would love to help them out based on the result that they got. And if they don't understand that result, sure, we'll dive into it. But like a lot of people, yeah, they go through tutorials, and I like what you said. It's just an instruction manual. That's a really good way to look at it. But I also agree with your personal project, your idea of personal projects. I think like that's how you stand out. That's how you showcase what you can do as a developer. And it also reinforces everything. Like, it really helps you learn to build that personal project out. You struggle, then you look up something a little bit more niche. You Google that and figure out, how do I overcome this obstacle specifically? Or you can also discover like, what fundamentals am I missing that is making me miss being able to build this module of my project. And that's important. So when I think of like, I get this question very often, and I have my own very specific answer to it. But for a backend developer, if you want to get into backend, what kind of projects should people build? Should do they need to build these templated projects or specific projects that you find like most employers love? Or like you said, like, do they need to be complex or just not complex? They just need to be impressive. What does that mean? Like, what kind of projects should aspiring backend developers build?
It's tricky to explain to a brand new developer what projects they should be building on the backend side, because there's like prerequisite knowledge. Like, what is a command line? Right? Like, you need to understand what a command line is before you can start building command line tools. You need to understand why a command line can be convenient, is a convenient way to like run a server, for example, instead of like a GUI application or through a web page. So my approach is like, learn foundational stuff and pretty quickly you should be building like pretty simple CLI tools. But as you go through learning more and more of this foundational stuff, you can build larger and larger projects. And kind of towards the end of that, you should be building some pretty sophisticated stuff. Backend projects don't look like what you might expect as a user of applications. And that's where I think a lot of people get hung up on. So if you've been using the internet for the last 20 years, it's really easy to imagine what an application looks like as a user of the application, right? Like, I'm going to build a to-do app, right? And I can add notes to it. I can subtract notes to it. Like, you've been a user of to-do apps before, you get what it should look like. Most of your backend applications are not going to be user-friendly in the sense that like a non-technical person would use them. They'll be developer-friendly. They'll have good developer experience. They should have good developer experience if you want it to be a good project. But the user of your application is probably another developer. So if you're building an API, for example, it'll be consumed by other developers. If you're building a command line tool, right, it'll be used by you or some other developer on the command line, or maybe an ops person, right? It automates something. So I kind of group most backend projects into like one of three buckets. You've got libraries, which are a great way. They're like honestly one of the best things that you can build, but like a library that is imported by backend projects. So you could imagine that you build like password strength detector, right? So this isn't like an application on its own, but it's like a library that someone can import into their backend so they can very easily detect the strength of a password, right? Because that's something you should do on the back end and not the front end if you want to be secure, right? Libraries are a great source of just inspiration. You can build tons of different libraries. Command line applications that automate something. So I've seen tons of projects that like pull data from some source, right? Maybe a weather API, right? Or the OpenAI API, right? If you're doing something with machine learning, but pulling data from some source, doing something interesting with it and shoving it somewhere else. Maybe it's outputting it to a CSV, right? So you can open it in Google Sheets. I've also seen a lot of backend developers that build projects with a quote unquote front end that is not like a custom website with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but like the front end is Google Sheets. Like, it's pulling data in and out. Tons of projects like that. I mentioned my StarCraft 2 battle simulator, right? This was a command line application. I could type like Marine fights Zergling, and it tells me who did more damage to who and what the result of the fight was. I hired a developer once who built essentially a parser. So imagine like a program that parsed Markdown and outputs HTML, something like that. Or a linter, right, that analyzes text files and tells you something interesting about it, or calculates, code coverage. You have to get into the mindset of a developer so that you can build tools that are useful for developers, because that's kind of the crux of being a backend engineer.
That's awesome advice. And I think that's a really good mindset to instill. You're not building tools for the users on the internet. You're building tools for other developers. There's a very big difference in that, and a very big difference in even the way that you present your projects and just the type of problems that you solve. It's a shift, right? This is where I think, kind of coding boot camps also dropped the ball a lot, is like really distinguishing the difference between those two and trying to prepare you to become a different type of developer. Because I do think front end and back end is very different, and the types of problems you solve. But yeah, that's really good advice. I like that. I rewatched these episodes anyways. You said a couple of great things that I just want to really reinforce. Yeah, I think all of that's really good advice. I just want to also be conscientious of your time. We got about 10 minutes left, but is there, I want to ask you one final question and anything other advice that you want to give towards backend developers, but like where do you think most aspiring backend developers are screwing up? Like what's that one big crucial piece of advice that you think would shift the momentum and the success rate for a lot of aspiring backend developers? And if we missed anything that you want to say, feel free to share it.
When you're learning online, and this isn't even necessarily specific to backend developers, but it can be. When you're learning online, the biggest thing you struggle with is just your own personal motivation and interest. Like by far, that's the big problem. It's not that the material is too hard, right? If you can do basic math and you can put in the time, you'll get through the material. Like it's not rocket science in that sense. But it can get dry at times, especially if you just aren't interested in the thing you happen to be learning, or maybe if the material is not presented in a more interesting way, or in a way that like is necessarily real world applicable. And there's two ways you can combat that, I would argue. The first is that really a lot of it's up to the educator. Like the material that you're using, and I mean, to an extent, you can choose your educators, right? You can choose your materials. But I do think that in particular, colleges and textbooks have really dropped the ball on this. There is an interesting way to explain fundamental concepts, and there's a less interesting way. And picking resources that try to keep it interesting, keep it relevant to the real world, keep it fun to the extent possible, are just going to be much easier to stick with. And that's not just I'm a lazy learner, I want to do it the fun way. That is owning up to, I believe, the fact that the biggest problem with everyone learning to code is staying motivated and staying interested. And if you can realize that that's the big problem, then going and trying to find the more interesting, the more fun resources is actually a very smart thing to do. It's kind of like going to the gym and exercise, right? Like the biggest problem with going to the gym and exercise is just that it's hard and you have to motivate yourself. So anything you can do to make it fun is a really good thing. But to some extent, like I said, I believe that's up to the platform. On Boot Dev, we're really trying to innovate in that area. It's frankly a big challenge, and I think that's why a lot of educational materials haven't done it. But just making it a game any way that you can, and keeping the projects that you're building interesting and relevant to what's interesting in your life is a big thing. We have a lot of World of Warcraft people in our Discord server, nice. And there's a lot of data that you can pull out of World of Warcraft, and you can calculate some pretty interesting things. And that's just a great way to keep yourself going.
That's pretty cool. Do you play WoW Hardcore?
So I played WoW quite a bit. This is like 10 or 15 years now. Dota is kind of my game at the moment. Okay. Dota 2.
Nice. Yeah. I've never played Dota, but I hear a lot of rage comes from it, but also
probably terrible things. Yeah. It's fun, crazy learning curve, kind of like development in that way. Like it takes a while to get into it, but
I like that. I feel like there are a lack of backend resources, like really dedicated to building backend developers. So I think your program has piqued my curiosity with that. So like, I guess what I'm asking is like, what about your program makes it unique? What do you think it makes it a very strong program and better prepares backend engineers?
Yeah, great question. There's really two things that I think make Boot Dev stand out and that we're really going for. There's a lot of great places to learn front end development on the internet. Like genuinely, like I have friends that create courses, create content in the front end world, and there are in the back end world too. It's just there's so few. There's just not that many places that are focused on back end, and everything they do is about the back end. So when I started Boot Dev, that was a big part of the passion project for me. I was like, I want somewhere that people can go to learn all of the stuff they need to know to get started with back end development, Python and Go. There's other great places to learn HTML and CSS. So that's one thing, is just kind of the laser focused nature of the platform on the backend side of the stack. And the fundamentals that we go into to make that happen, because that's just, you just can't compromise on like some of these CS basics, SQL things we've talked about. But then the other even bigger thing is this thing around gamification and keeping it fun. Like I said, the biggest failure mode for people getting into development is giving up. Not because it's necessarily too hard, but just because they kind of got bored. So, building things like quests into the app, XP, gems, items, like stuff that just keeps you coming back to do another lesson or doing another assignment, is something that's really exciting to me. It's not necessarily for everyone, but if you're the kind of person that likes video games, right, you like unlocking achievements, it can be something that, especially in the harder lessons that, again, I think are required, but the lessons around like data structures, algorithms, binary trees, keeping that as fun as you can is just a smarter way to go about it.
I like that. I think gamified courses do really well. And like you said, a lot of people's motivation, it dies, it wavers, and it's tough to keep that fire ignited. It's a long journey. And just because your motivation dies, like, it's important to realize it doesn't mean you're not meant to become a developer. It's just, you got to constantly reignite that fire. So I like the gamification. That sounds interesting. Is there anything else you want to shout out?
The only other thing I'd say, which like, it's sad that this is a differentiator, but like, we're very focused on building. So like at almost no point in the course are you just reading or watching videos. The whole time you're either writing code in the browser, writing the code on your local machine, running tests against it. You've got to be building the whole time. And, we intersperse building, like solving the challenges that we've laid out, passing the unit tests, building guided projects, building completely personal projects from scratch. Like, having that mix is really important. I don't want to say that's our big differentiator, because there are other platforms where you can get that kind of an experience. But like, that's crazy to me. I genuinely believe that everyone's core resource for learning programming should be building first. And so as long as you've got your hands on the keyboard, I feel like you're making some sort of progress. I've been blown away by some of the students I've talked to who've been like, no, like, I feel like I just want to, this is the crazy one. I learn better visually, so I'm just going to watch videos. That's not true of anyone. Not the sense that you don't learn well visually, but in the sense that, like, if you're not doing it, it's not sticking.
I like that. I like how much you pushed that in this episode. Okay, that's pretty much it. And anyone watching on YouTube, like, if you have different opinions, feel free to leave them in the comments. But I'm really curious about how many people are actually trying to become backend developers, because I said this to start with. I truly, like, it sucks because a lot of people feel like they can't become backend developers, and it's like 5 years down the road. It's just not true. It's just not. So hopefully this enlightened your path a little bit, but yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I should have asked you before the episode, do you prefer Wags Lane or Lane?
Lane is great. That's just my handle.
Awesome. Okay. I'll include your socials below, but seriously, Lane, thank you so much for coming on.
Awesome. Thanks. Great to talk to you again, Don.